Welcome to Swami Reacts, and today we will be sharing some reflections about my recent reading of Sri Krishna Prem's The Yoga of the Bhagavad Gita. As you may know, Bhagavad Gita is a unique text, universal text of wisdom embraced not only by the tradition I belong to, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, but throughout the Hindu umbrella, Hinduism, and beyond even. That was one of the main texts that connected me initially to my own tradition. And I'm always curious about reading different commentaries. There are endless commentaries to the Bhagavad Gita. I cannot even name how many, from different traditions, from different perspectives, because in one sense the universality of the text lends itself to various readings. We have our own particular Gaudiya Vaishnava reading, and even in that case there are many commentaries and not all of them are the same, not all of them agree or read a particular verse in exactly the same way, complementary perspectives, at times a few of them contradictory even, what to speak of other schools, other thoughts. So I was curious about this commentary, especially after having read a few months ago Swami Krishna Prem's biography, A Wing and a Prayer. We did a Swami Reacts based on that. And after discovering how Swami Krishna Prem, though beginning as a Gaudiya Vaishnava, at least at some point of his journey, at the very end of his life, he kind of embraced a form of universalism in which Gaudiya Vaishnavism not only was not the exclusive path of his choice, but also not the main one even, I will say. And probably many of the core beliefs of the tradition Swami Krishna Prem, to some degree or another, may have dismissed. I'm not saying this as a criticism of him, because for those of you who saw my review of A Wing and a Prayer, you can see that I really appreciated the book and I really honored the integrity and seriousness of his way of embracing life and practice, though I may disagree with him on some things, like we used to disagree with each other on so many things. So anyhow, I was curious with Krishna Prem's universalist approach and considering the Bhagavad Gita's own universalist presentation, which can lend itself to be read in so many ways. I was quite intrigued by this commentary, knowing that and discovering when I read it that Swami Krishna Prem there refers, of course, to Hindu texts, especially Upanishads, Shankaracharya's commentary. His commentary will see is very influenced by Advaita Vedanta, but also by Greek mythology, modern psychology, mystical Christianity, Buddhism, and so on and so forth. So I was intrigued. And again, I read it, I finished it some days ago. I really appreciated it, but also I was quite surprised by how strongly Swami Krishna Prem's reading of the Bhagavad Gita was in terms of Advaita Vedanta. It basically will read like a classical orthodox Advaiting, at least not orthodox because he's quoting Plato and Carl Jung and so on, but in terms of his strong emphasis on total unity with Brahman, what I may call radical non-dualism, as the ultimate only goal. And basically speaking of the notion of theism, a personal God, and one praying to a personal God as forms of sentimentalism, and things that of course are quite different from the usual Gaudiya Vedanta perspective and the tradition at least in part of his journey, he embraces his. So it was an interesting experience for me to go through the commentary. To be honest, it's one of the first times I'm reading a non-Gaudiya Vaishnava commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. I've heard a few readings and commentaries on certain verses by Shankara and so on, and in the future I plan to take more time to explore their perspectives, mostly to understand them properly and to appreciate all that needs to be appreciated. At the same time, it was particular for me because, again, I'm a Gaudiya Vaishnava. I define myself as such, though not to the extreme of being unable of getting nerves from other traditions. But still I have my bhakti samskars, my devotional impressions coming from this life, probably others by divine grace. So I learn and I tend to read the Bhagavad Gita in a very personal way. And I was never going too much into the depths of how an Advaitin will read Bhagavad Gita and how they will emphasize Brahman over and over again. And whenever something personal or devotional-like appears to come to the surface, somehow or other, it's all explained in the context of the ultimate realization of Brahma Sayuja. So due to my bhakti samskars, the experience was kind of anticlimactic, so to say. I can understand for someone with Gyan samskars, with impressions for Gyan, for Brahman, readings like this will be totally inspiring and nourishing. I'm not saying I was not inspired and nourished by many perspectives, but at the same time, again, carrying my devotional momentum, parts of the reading felt anticlimactic, especially expecting some degree of personalism, so to say, emphasis on personalism coming from someone like Swami Krishna Prem. So something interesting that happened as a result of that was I was reading Swami Krishna Prem's commentary, which does not include the original verses, but just his commentary on the side of the different pages. You can see the numbers of the verse coming on the sides. So in an attempt to understand which verses he was addressing and what he was actually saying, what was a literal translation, what was more of an interpretation or a reading, I simultaneously was studying a Bhagavad Gita commentary published by a Gaudiya Vaishnava scholar, Sanskrit scholar, which in my opinion includes, among others, a very literal translation of the Sanskrit, from Sanskrit to English, as literal as possible. And something interesting that also happened was that I realized that many verses of the Gita, and I read the Gita many times from different editions, again, different translations, but in this very literal one, coming from a Gaudiya Vaishnava, of course, I realized even more, I was already aware of this, but I realized on another dimension how much, actually, the Bhagavad Gita also speaks about Brahman, how the word Brahman appears so many times in the Gita, and how much the Bhagavad Gita, therefore, could be read quite easily through an impersonal lenses, which I'm not against because Brahman is one of the three facets of the Absolute according to our tradition, right? Advaita Vedanta Brahmeti Paramadmeti Bhagavaniti Shabdyate. As I wrote recently in a series of articles on Gaudiya Vedanta and religious pluralism, addressing a conversation I had with Swami Medhananda, in how our tradition will emphasize Bhagavan, the personal God, bhakti, loving devotion, individuality of the soul, but not to the point that it denies the possibility of an eternal merging into the impersonal, without cancelling, in our opinion, the individuality of the soul, but giving an eternal experience of non-differentiatedness. And in those series of articles, at one point I referred to the Bhagavad Gita and shared a series of verses that very naturally could be read and lend itself in a very direct reading, no interpretation but reading, to think in terms of Brahman and impersonal realization, and many other verses, of course, which could be read very naturally in terms of Bhagavan and devotion and bhakti as the higher thing, but others, Brahman, as the higher thing. So in the same way that the Gaudiya Vaishnava, every time they find the word Brahman in the Bhagavad Gita or even in the Bhagavatam, which also includes its own Advaitin-like sections, a Gaudiya Vaishnava may read Brahman as not impersonal Brahman, Nirguna Brahma, but as Bhagavan, Para-Brahman, since Brahman means he who expands and makes others expand, he who grows and makes others grow. And therefore one could read with one's Gaudiya lenses Brahman as applying to Bhagavan ultimately, or a Gaudiya may interpret some passages which are overtly Advaitin to fit into a more personalistic narrative. And many Gaudiya commentators or Vaishnava commentators from other lineages have done so. Similar Advaitins, and Krishna Prem is not an exception here, have read many sections of the Bhagavad Gita that literally mean something very clear in a devotional direction, personal direction. They read those sections in more interpretive way. And while I disagree with some of them, or I have a difference of opinion, I also appreciate some of them. I also appreciate the interpretive approach to scripture. That's a whole different conversation. I don't want to get too long here about it. But you can read scripture literally, and it's important. There are things that need to be read literally. When the literal reading doesn't make much sense, you can read it interpretive. There is symbol, there's archetype present, and you can also read in an experiential, participatory, esoteric way, where you're actually being part of scripture. So there are very interesting sections in Krishna Prem's commentary in which he mentions this idea of the interpretive reading, not necessarily using that particular expression. I'd like to share a few parts with you. For example, he says in the very introduction to the book, when he's describing the general setting and the background of the battlefield, the Battle of Kurukshetra, he says, without going into the question as to whether all incidents of the Mahabharata have a symbolic significance and whether it is possible to trace a consistent symbolism all through the vast epic, it must be clear to all those who have eyes that there is an inner significance behind the events thus inadequately summarized. There is no need to ask the question whether the author of the Mahabharata had such a symbolism consciously in his mind. Many, perhaps most, great works of art are filled with symbolism that is often quite unplanned by the conscious minds of their creators. And sometimes this symbolism is truer and more profound from the fact of its having descended from a region beyond the realm of conscious thinking. So I can definitely appreciate this. It makes me think about, of course, the Bhagavad Gita being compiled by Vyasa. And in many occasions we hear things like Vyasa Vitina Vetiva, in this case more specifically about the Bhagavatam. Vyasa may know or may not know the essence of the Bhagavatam. Why? Because somehow revelation passed through him. So sometimes we are not fully aware of the implications of what we are writing about, of what is being revealed through us. So therefore, many times we may say something that has lots of meaning, even on a literal way or level, but there's way more symbolism and archetypal content and layers of significance that could be drawn beyond the awareness of the author itself, or beyond the awareness of the vessel through which the revelation came. So I can definitely appreciate what Krishna Prem is saying here in this regard. And here comes one of the many symbolic readings he makes, especially in connection to the characters of the Gita, which is famous by many commentators as representing something. Dhritarashtra, Duryodhan, this or that. So Swami Krishna Prem says here, Dhritarashtra, on the other hand, represents the empirical ego, the lower and transient personality which, blinded by egoism and foolish infatuation, wields a nominal sway over the kingdom of the body, which has unjustly seized, the word Dhritarashtra meaning one who has seized the kingdom. Although he arrogates to himself the title of king, yet his rule over the kingdom is merely nominal, for the real power lies with his Asuric sons, just as the human personality which so proudly says, I, is the sport of a continual succession of involuntary desires and passions which are the real rulers of the body it calls its own. Of course, you can at this point appreciate the rich English expression, which I really love, how Krishna Prem speaks in many parts in a very poetic way. And again, besides differences of opinion and not subscribing myself to the Advaitin perspective as my own chosen path and reading different verses in different ways, still, there are many interesting insights in this commentary. I'd like to share a few with you before we conclude here. So one comes from chapter 2, in connection to the famous section where Arjuna is at one point saying, I surrender to you as a disciple, but eventually he will tell Krishna, I won't fight, Nayotcha, Nayotcha. And of course, this section has been interpreted in many ways. Arjuna won't fight because he has surrendered, so now he's an instrument, so he's not performing his action from a false sense of I am the doer. But some others have actually interpreted it like, no, actually Arjuna says, I surrender to you, Krishna, as my guide, guru. But very quickly after that, he presented some opposition to his previous surrender. So that's the the place where Krishna Prem goes here, as other Gaudiya commentators as well. And he explains this, I will not fight. And again, take it beyond Arjuna and apply it to ourselves. Arjuna refuses to abandon his dejection and cries out bitterly, Na yotsya, I will not fight. Profoundly significant are these words, for they express the very fault we are always committing. The disciple appeals for teaching to the Guru, either to the divine Lord within or to his embodiment in human form, and professes his willingness to serve him utterly. But, spoken or unspoken, there always remains a reservation. Lord, I am yours and will do your bidding, but ask not of me one thing, for that I cannot do. I will not fight. So this is a classical situation, right? Gurudev, I will follow you, tell me whatever, but except for this. Krishna, I want to surrender to you. Send whatever you want in my life except for this. So it's still in the beginning of the journey. And again, this section of the Gita acknowledges that at some part of the journey we still may have this conditional approach, not unconditional. Still some conditions in the contract. Swami Krishna Prem likes that very interestingly. Let me share another section. Two more. One from chapter 7, related to verse 28. He's speaking about sin, the notion of sin, which again, with certain cultural layers, each one of us will interpret in so many different ways. He says, sin does not mean the infringement of any arbitrary code of morals worked out by human reason or set forth in holy books. Sin is the assertion of a separate self, the making of difference where in truth none exists. Sin is the central ignorance which sees the separate, personal self as real and seeks its own gain, though the whole world perish. Of course, from Krishna Prem's Advaita reading, this will mean ultimately there's no separate self at all, there's only Brahman. But from our Gaudiya reading, we could take this and still apply it to our theology, saying the separate sense of self, leaving our self as if we exist in total isolation, as a total fragmented unit from the center, while actually reality is inseparable with the common center. So the false ego or the false self, the temporary separatistic self, that's what we mean here by sin. Not so much failing morally in one way or another, but perceiving ourselves as utterly independent and separate from everything else. Avidya, the root cause of every other things that come after that. Duality, fear, defense mechanisms, leading a life trying to fulfill a false sense of being. But it all begins with avidya, with seeing ourselves for who we are not, as separate beings. Not in any impersonal way, in our case, but in a pretty personal way, but still, we have to establish a proper non-dual foundation, even for a Vaishnava or personalistic perspective. Let me share with you one more section that I really appreciate, which is the very beginning of chapter 9, arguably one of the most important chapters of the Gita, Raja Vidya Yoga. Swami Krishna Prem calls it the yoga of the royal science. Vidya, science, and Raja like royal of the kings. And royal secret, Raja Vidya Raja Guhyam. So I'll share a few words related to the first two verses of this chapter, very important ones. He says, the royal secret, and for us all this speaks about bhakti, Raja Vidya, the king of knowledge, the king of education, of secrets. The royal secret is not one that can be told in words. Throughout the world runs a tradition of a wondrous secret sought under different names by men through all the ages. The philosopher's stone, the elixir of immortality, the Holy Grail, the hidden name of God, all these have been the objects of men's quests, and all are one if rightly understood. No pen can ever write down this secret, nor can any lips reveal it, but it is written in the inmost heart of man, and has lain there through countless ages, awaiting the day when the disciple, tearing aside the veils of ignorance, perceives its blazing letters in his heart. There is no man or woman, however mean and sinful, in whose heart it is not written, but few there are who read its life-giving words. So this is speaking about the soul's potential for love. At least that will be our reading. One last section. But the Gita proclaims man's inherent freedom from all such fetters. He's talking about that, fetters before. The man who treads the path sees for himself the truth, not in some promised heaven after death, but here in this very life. Here are no books demanding blind unreasoning obedience, no priests waving the keys which unlock heavens and hells. The truth, once seen, shines by its own resplendent light, and he who drinks of its waters shall never thirst again, quoting Jesus. This is connected to verse 2, where Krishna says, Pratyaksha Bhagamam. Bhakti is understood by personal experience. When you have a personal experience of the truth, there you have your path. So anyhow, a few words and thoughts related to my recent reading of the Yoga of the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Krishna Prem, or Sri Krishna Prem, he appears here. It was an interesting experience, no doubt. For me, it's always very inspiring to have a healthy exposure to other ways of thinking, and especially to reading texts that sometimes we kind of own, though the Bhagavad Gita is not strictly and exclusively Gaudiya text, though primary for us, also primary for many other schools. So it's an interesting and humbling and sobering experience to approach a text that I'm so familiar with, and I'm so familiar with the perspective of my tradition about it, and read it from another perspective, from another lenses. I think it's a very healthy exercise for us to expose to that. Maybe not for everyone in the very beginning of the journey, but for sure at some point of the journey, expose ourselves to different articulations of the same truth from different points of view. And even if we may disagree with some of them, still daring to learn and be enriched by parts of it, and learning to love each other, not only learning to agree that we can disagree, but as I like to say, learning to love each other despite disagreements. So if you have ever read this book, The Yoga of the Bhagavad Gita by Sri Krishna Prem, please share your thoughts in the comment section, or share any thoughts you have regarding the thoughts we have been sharing here, and see you in our next episode of Swami Reacts.